Good afternoon, Grace Community Chapel family. Great to be here with you today. Feeling a little under the weather today myself. Just a little bit, I think, of a head cold kind of got grasp on me. So I'm staying home tonight to not pass along to anyone at the prayer meeting tonight. So I will miss those of you who regularly attend that. But I did want to at least get on here today and do our daily reading in Ecclesiastes. So we'll be taking a look specifically at Ecclesiastes chapter 5, and I actually just need to fix something real fast in the stream. Hopefully that corrected for you guys so you'll see better. There we go. Yep. We're going to be looking at Ecclesiastes chapter 5, and we'll be taking a look specifically at this section. There's a lot of interesting stuff that's commented in this section. So I'm looking forward to reading it with you and going over some of the specifics in it. So let's go ahead and take a look at the text. Guard your steps when you go into the house of God. To draw near is to listen, and to listen is better than to offer sacrifice of fools. For they do not know what they are that they are doing evil. Be not rash with your mouth, nor let your hearts be hasty to utter a word before God. For God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few. For a dream comes with much business, and a fool's voice with many words. When you vow a vow to God, do not delay in paying it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow than you should vow and not pay. Let not your mouth lead you into sin, and do not say before the messenger that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry at your voice and destroy the work of your hands? For when dreams increase and words grow many, there is vanity, but God is the one you must fear. If you see in a providence the oppression of the poor and a violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter. For the high official is watched by a higher, and yet there are higher ones over them. But this is the gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivating fields. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This is also a vanity. When goods increase, they will increase who eat them. What advantage has the owner over them but to see them with his eyes? Sweet is this sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. There is a grievous evil that I have seen under the sun. Riches were kept by their owner to his hurt, and those riches were lost in a bad venture. And he is a father of a son, but had nothing in his hand. And as he came from his mother's womb, so he shall go again. Naked he came, and he shall take nothing for his toil, that he may carry away in his hand. This is also a grievous evil. Just as he came, he shall go. And whatever gain is there to him who toils for the wind. Moreover, all of his days he eats in darkness, and much vexation, and sickness and anger. Behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil which one toils under the sun, for the few days of his life that God has given him with his lot. Everyone who also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them, and to accept his lot and to rejoice in his toil, this is the gift of God. For he will not run to remember the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with joys in his heart. That's Ecclesiastes chapter 5. So let's jump back up to the beginning of the section here. Two major points that Koheleth, the preacher, is making. First off, he starts off with this idea of what the ESV is also titled Fear God. He makes the comment of guarding your steps when you go into the house of God. Now, he's talking to the people of Israel. It's possible he's talking, I'm of the impression that he is talking well after the times of Solomon. Probably, at least 50 to 150 years after Solomon. But he says, guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Here's where he's getting them the idea of pause and stop and think about who God is. He concludes in verse 7 that God is the one that you must fear. That there's this element to which when you go before God, the type of way of you approaching God, you have to be evaluating it, because God actually has control over things. In his conclusion in chapter 5, he actually concludes something very interesting, and I don't know if you heard this or not, and I just want to point it out to you, is that in verse 18, one toils under the sun the few days of his life that God has given him, for this is his lot. So he ascribes the number of days of an individual's life has been given to them by God. That's something that God gives them, and it's something that God has control of. And then the next thing he says in verse 19, everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them. So he also sees that if you have wealth, if you have possessions, and I think it's interesting, the power to enjoy them, that can be both physical enablement, or that could be potentially a social, political power to enjoy those things. He says those things are from God. And so, those, as he says specifically in verse 19, this is a gift of God. So he sees God as really providentially providing for and giving everything to man. And so when he sees that and he has that perspective, he says, be thinking about how you interact with God, because God has control over everything in your life. And so, he's telling people to be very cautious in how they approach God. Now, as Christians in the 21st century, really Christians past Christ, we approach the throne of grace with boldness because we have been told to approach with boldness. So we've been told to approach that God is willing to hear our prayers, and that because Christ is our advocate, that he is before the Father advocating for us. And even the Spirit himself is interceding with words that we can't even express. But at the same time, throughout even the New Testament, we have to remember who God is. And that's specifically what the preacher is speaking to. He's saying, he's reminding them who God is. In Proverbs 15:8, the passage says this: the sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord, but the prayer of the upright is acceptable to him. And thinking about that, we see that there's this offering the sacrifice of fools. Well, what is that? Well, that's when the wicked person comes before the temple in the house of God, and hasn't been guarding his steps and just does whatever he wants, and then tries to offer a sacrifice to appease God. He says they offer the sacrifice, for they do not know that they're doing evil. The sacrifice means nothing to God. God doesn't account it as anything because they're doing evil and they're not pursuing after him. The reality is obedience is better than sacrifice. Christ himself comments that he's seeking people who will obey the Father and then who will obey him. We can't divorce from our understanding, that understanding in the New Testament or the Old Testament. Even under grace, there is an expectation of us pursuing obedience to the Father in Christ. And so with this, Kohelet is saying, guard yourselves, be mindful of how you're approaching God. And then he goes on in verse 2, and he says, be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God, for God is in heaven and you are on earth. He says, look, God's way above you, and you're on the earth, so be careful what you say because of who God is. He says, in fact, better off to let your words be very few. He says, because a dream comes with much business and a fool's voice with many words. So the idea here being is that your dream comes when you've done much business. You bring about what you're wanting to happen. But a fool's voice comes with many words. The more you speak, the more foolish you end up being. And then he says, when you vow, if you do vow, make sure you pay it, because he has no pleasure in the fool. And he says, pay what you owe. In fact, it's better off that you should not vow, that you should vow and not pay. So he said, let not your mouth lead you into sin, and do not say before the messenger, that's the priest, that it was a mistake. Because why should God be angry at your voice and destroy the work of your hands? He sees God retributively handling someone who doesn't pay their vow. And he says, for when dreams increase and words grow many, there is vanity. But God is the one that you must fear. You can't causally determine the things that are going to happen in your life. God ultimately is the one that's in control. He's the one you should fear. So it'd be better to listen and to act in silence than to act in disobedience or vow to do something you do not intend on doing. And so he kind of gives people that perspective, and then he kind of jumps into something that feels contrary, but he's going to wrap that back up like I've already shown you in verse 19 and 20. But in verse 8, he says, if you see in a providence the oppression of the poor and the violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter. Which is an interesting thing to say. He's already talked about this before in chapter 4. He's talking about it again in chapter 5. And he's saying, when you see these things, don't be amazed, don't be surprised, because every official is watched by a higher, and yet there's even higher ones over them. And what he's talking about here, it's multiple layer of corruption. Now, this being said, this doesn't make sense, again, for King Solomon to be saying. This does make sense in the context of the Jewish nation well after Solomon, where there is tons of oppression and violations of justice and righteousness, and that the entire leadership of Israel is corrupted. So that would make sense in the context. And so, we see here that ultimately Kohelet points out that, look, the issue of the providence that's an oppression of poor people and the violation of justice and righteousness, ultimately it's a top-down thing. And so it's the highest officials that are causing the issues, which are continually causing corruption further on down. And he says, but there's a gain for the land in every way if a king is committed to cultivating the fields. If the king is focused on the lowest level and making sure to caretake for the lowest level, everything else will be taken care of properly. And that's why we need a good king like Christ, not like the many kings that we see on the earth today. Then he says in verse 10, he says, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This is also a vanity. This verse comes to me fairly often when I see people pursuing after wealth, because this is the reality. If you love money, you will never be satisfied with it. It will never meet your need. And if you love wealth, your income's never going to be enough. You're always going to be looking to achieve the next level of income. And I can express this, even in my own life, as my income grew and grew and grew. I found that when my income grew, my lifestyle grew to meet my income. And this is just the reality of how we work. And if I continued to love that income, the desire would be to continue to want to make just a little bit more, just a little bit more, just a little bit more. And the thing is that there's ultimately no end to that. There's no end when we're satisfied, because we see that in verse 10 and 11. Then we see in verse 12, they will never find rest. And then verse 13 and 14, we see that riches can be lost. Verse 17, his identity and value are lost to him once his riches are lost. And verse 10, 15, 16, and 17 says that he endures a life and end that is meaningless. The idea here being, if you pursue money as your end, you love money, you pursue that, it's habal. It is meaningless. It is a chasing after the wind. You'll never be satisfied. You'll never find rest. Riches can ultimately be lost, and in fact, oftentimes they are lost. And then with that, oftentimes your identity and your value are lost as well. So, what he determines, what Kohelet determines from this text is ultimately what we find specifically towards the end, is that God gives all of these things. And so, verse 18, what I've seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun in the few days of his life that God has given him. For this is his lot. Basically, enjoy what God has given you. Again, this is under the sun. This is not necessarily a Christian eternal perspective, or even really a Jewish eternal perspective. This is just looking at under the sun and evaluating wisdom from under the sun. Just enjoy what you have. Take stock. Enjoy what your labor. Enjoy to the best of your ability. Be content, and thank God for whatever He has given you. And verse 20, for he will not be remembered the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied in the joy of his heart. This is the concept here, that just find joy in the Lord and what the Lord has brought you, and you'll be okay. Now, life doesn't have meaning there. They'll talk about that in a little bit still, how that's a tabel. It doesn't have meaning, but at least you can find joy and contentment and happiness. And this is the goal specifically according to Kohelet. And I think it's interesting that 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 6 through 10 talks very much like this. But godliness with contentment is great gain. For what we brought nothing into this world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, to a snare, to many senseless, harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. And that's where we need to stop. We need to say, look, I'm not going to pursue after wealth. I'm not going to pursue after money. Instead, I'm going to be content with what God has given me. Be thankful for what God has given me. And enjoy the work that God has given me. And I think that's fulfilling exactly what we see specifically in Philippians, where Paul says, not that I'm speaking of being in need, for I've learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. And in any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty, and hunger, and abundance, and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. This is the element, is that ultimately we find our joy in the Lord, we find our joy in his strength, and we find our joy in the things that he gives us, whether it's a little or whether it's a lot, and we find contentment in the work that he has provided us to do today. That is what we have in Ecclesiastes chapter 5. Sorry for the interruptions, got some internet issues today, probably related to the weather and whatnot, but I hope that you guys were able to get through it, and if not, I'm sure it'll come up all the way through on the re-recording because it'll have resent it afterwards. So, but God bless you all. Have a great rest of your evening. Sorry about missing you. Those are you who are at Wednesday night service tonight. I hope to be back in the swing of things tomorrow, and look forward to doing some more reading with you in Ecclesiastes tomorrow. God bless you all. Have a great night.